Things are really starting to heat up because the NRL is chasing one of the biggest media deals ever in Australia, more than $4 billion over 5 years. But this week, negotiations, well, they have taken another turn. NRL CEO Andrew Abdo is leaving for Tennis Australia right in the middle of the process. And at the same time, news breaking that Amazon Prime is planning a bid for the TV rights. This is the same company that owns Thursday Night Football in the NFL in the US. They've got Champions League football rights in Europe, some hockey in Canada, and they could now be coming for Australian Rugby League. And according to new reporting in the Australian Financial Review, there are people inside Rugby League who believe recent rule changes may also have a bit of a commercial motive. More tries, more stoppages, more post-try advertising opportunities, right when the NRL is trying to sell the game for unprecedented money. So today on Moneyball, what's really happening inside the NRL's broadcast negotiations, and just how much pressure is Peter V'landys under to pull off a mega media deal?
And now it's time.
It's time!
It's time for
Moneyball.
Moneyball.
Are you familiar with the story of Moneyball?
Well, welcome to Moneyball, the business of sport, the show for sports insiders and for fans that want to know what is really going on inside the game. And we've got a bumper show for you today. I'm your host, Scott Keenan. And Peter V'landys, well, he is a bloody big character, saying this week that he would need Superman and Jesus to replace the outgoing NRL CEO, Andrew Abdo. Well, could V'landys himself be that replacement? And could he also pull off one of the biggest media deals in Australian sports history as his right-hand man heads off to Tennis Australia? Now, we've been following this story pretty closely here on Moneyball, and there are some big new developments this week with reporting from Sam Buckingham-Jones in the Australian Financial Review. I'm going to bring him in now. Sam, thanks for joining me. You've got Andrew Abdo leaving in the middle of negotiations, Peter V'landys staking a claim for a $4 billion deal, and Amazon reportedly circling now and interested in the rights as well. Just how big a moment is this for the NRL?
Look, you can't downplay how significant this is for the NRL, Scott. I mean, Peter V'landys has been for years talking about how he's going to get a bigger deal than the AFL. And the AFL got, if you recall, $4.5 billion over 7 years from 2025. So it's going to be a few years of the NRL accepting a materially lower amount from its broadcast partners, which they overlap. Foxtel is actually is covering both the AFL and so he's been waiting for this moment for years, waiting for this current contract to expire. And just literally the day before the bids were due, Andrew Abdo announced he was going to Tennis Australia. So that's a really significant moment in itself. He is sticking around until July 15, which gives us, 6 weeks or so. And at the press conference on Monday, Peter V'landys said he hopes to have the deal done by then, which is an extraordinary thing. 6 weeks is a really short time frame to hammer out a deal.
It's incredible.
At scale. And yeah, so one of the pieces of information that I managed to glean from this pretty tightly kept process for the most part is that Amazon is interested and intends to submit an offer of some sort. I have no idea the extent of their offer. I don't know whether they're just going to go for one game a week as they have in Canada with hockey, or whether, left of field, they could come and try and make a play for every streaming right out there. But what's the date? Today is Wednesday. Yesterday, Foxtel and Nine Entertainment pitched to Peter V'landys and Andrew Abdo, the CEO of Nine Entertainment, in a room with the head of streaming and broadcast pitching their plan, which itself is a big deal.
Yeah, this is moving really quickly because the starter's gun was really only fired a few weeks ago. As you said, Foxtel and Nine are the incumbent broadcasters in Australia. Of course, they're going to be taking pitches as well from broadcasters in New Zealand too. Sky Sports has got the rights there at the moment. You talked about Amazon in your story in the Australian Financial Review, and you've mentioned there that they do have sports in Europe. Of course, they've got Champions League there. They've got hockey in Canada. They do some stuff with the NFL in the US as well. How serious do you think their interest is in the National Rugby League?
Well, it's hard to say at the moment. I mean, when I wrote about it, I went and found some comments that the Amazon global head of sport, a guy called Jay Marine, made on a pretty niche podcast for sports administrators and the sporting industry. And he said that we want your favorite sport in every country that Prime is in. And in order to move the needle for Prime, which already has 5 million subscribers in Australia, it's a bit hard to know how many of those people are subscribing for the streaming service versus the free delivery. But, in order to move the needle materially, they need big sports. And he said, we're willing to pay out to get them. But, they have some NFL, they have a slice of the hockey in Canada so far. And they do have some soccer in other places like the Champions League you mentioned. So far, they haven't really gone big in that they haven't sort of gone for the full scope of, NHL rights in Canada. Could Australia be the first place that they do that? It's possible. I would lean towards probably not. But the challenge is if they go for a single game a week or something like that is doing exactly what Peter V'landys said he didn't want to do, which is forcing fans to pay more. So that's splitting the rights. It's increasing the charge to be able to access all of the NRL games. And so, comments that I've sort of got from people who follow this more closely than I do is that all the NRL needed is a serious stalking horse to jack up the price. And they won $4 billion, which is a heck of a lot of money in a declining free-to-air advertising market. And, I'm sure there are plenty of frustrated Foxtel and Kayo fans out there who have weathered a lot of price hikes over the last few years. That is literally to cover the cost for these sports. Like they barely, to cover these costs, people have to pay a lot of money.
Yeah, and you're looking at a near doubling of the deal if they get $4 billion plus this time around. So they've got to find the money somewhere. And you talked about a declining ad market. Just how much worse from your reporting is it now compared to, say, when the AFL did their deal a few years ago?
Well, so to put it in perspective, the AFL signed a deal in 2022, late 2022, for the deal that began in 2025. In 2022, the free-to-air ad market was worth a little over $4 billion. About 2 years later, it was 3.3. So, $800 million just gone from free-to-air television. Everyone in that industry has always sort of said, it's just it's a cyclical low. The money's going to come back. But I think there is a growing school of thought that it's not. And free-to-air networks are now grappling with the fact that they don't have $800 million plus that's been ripped out of the industry and sent to, Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Google and YouTube, that literally, they have way less money to spend on these things, that there've been people who've spoken to me, not in a way that I can report over the years, who've said, literally, the last 15 years, every dollar that has disappeared from free-to-air networks has gone into sport. So as their earnings has declined, the value of sport has increased at literally the exact same rate. So every spare dollar networks have is being ploughed into sport. And I guess the only option really, if free-to-air is not going to cover that cost, is subscriptions. And so, the news last night was that Nine is planning a bid for the entire suite of NRL rights. They want everything. They want to cut Foxtel out, who's been the incumbent broadcaster of some of the NRL for 30 years. And I think they must have figured out a way to make the maths work, essentially, where Stan and free-to-air and, publishing and billboards that they own various elements of is a better way to make money from this than just streaming or just free-to-air.
Yeah, and I think Stan is increasingly coming into their thinking, looking at how they can make Stan Sport bigger to get more subscribers to that service. They've added other sports there, netball and NBL recently, and I can see them, really gearing up to think about how can they plug the NRL, the biggest game in the country now, into that product to get more people subscribed. One thing I found really interesting in your story this week was the suggestion that there's been discussion in rugby league circles that rule changes this year may have actually been planned to create more penalties, more sticks agains and more tries, which has allowed more stoppages in the game and more commercial airtime. More time for broadcasters to run ads. It's really interesting because I think for a long time, with so much more ball in play, there's less times where they can run the traditional 15-second, 30-second ad, and they've had lots more integrations of sponsorship and advertising into the screen, but not in those sort of traditional ads. From what you understand, do you reckon the NRL is actively juicing its content this way to make it more commercially appealing in the context of this broadcast negotiation?
If you speak to anyone who is a expert in sports rights monetization, and there are those people out there, it's a fantastic job title, then they will tell you that the AFL currently has a slightly lower audience than the NRL, but is still worth more And that is because the format of AFL, every time that a goal or a behind is scored, is an ad break. And there are a lot of goals. And there's also, it's in quarters. So every, quarter gives you a chance to run a bunch more ads. So the format of NRL, which is, occasional tries, halftime, you can monetize literally the cross to the guy, sitting along the ground. You can monetize the video referee. You can monetize all these different things. But fundamentally, the number of ad breaks you have is how lucrative that sport is. And NRL, looking at the maths, is less lucrative than the AFL. So that is why the NRL rights have always been worth less than the AFL. So that's just to say that the rule change that they introduced this year about, the 6 again rule has had the effect of increasing the number of tries. The calculation that I did was that it had lifted it from about 730 last year to a little over 800 this year, so about 10. So they've made the game 10% more lucrative than it was last year for in-game ads at least, and in-game at least is when people are least likely to go and grab a cup of tea or something like that. So they are probably the best ad slots to chuck an ad in. Is that a deliberate thing? I don't know. I mean, different people have different views. The people who spoke to me about it didn't want to go on the record and say it. They just said it's just interesting. It seems coincidental. But then when you speak to a media company about it, they'll say, look, we've had 11 rounds of one season. Like, that's not enough to base a future, price of a sport on. Like, if they wanted this to be a material factor, they probably had to introduce it a year or two ago. And they haven't. But still, I look at it and go, a 1-year trial is what they've announced. This is after consultation, and the effect it's had is to improve its value to broadcasters. Seems coincidental, at least.
Yeah, it's a nice consequence for them. And if that's where they end up, look, I wouldn't be surprised to see them cut the game into quarters. They're obviously bringing more teams in, Papua New Guinea and Perth coming into the competition. Yeah. It would be, but like Peter V'landys, he's the kind of guy that I think would do it. And he's such a big character. You've got clubs, including the Roosters, the Tigers and the Storm, all on the record in the last day or so saying that they back him to go in as the new CEO, that they would approve a change to the constitution of the NRL to allow him to be an executive chairman, which would be quite unusual. We've never had that in the game for a long, long time. It does also seem strange to me that he has put that big figure out there, and he's done it for some time now, $4 billion for 5 years, as such a big fat goal. Did people that you spoke to for this story view this as a real legacy-defining deal for him?
The words are that multiple people said to me, sort of unprompted, was they viewed this as he has staked his reputation on this deal. And if anything, the deal that we currently have, $2 billion over the 5 years, was a misstep because the AFL got such a better deal. And so he now needs to not only strike a new deal, he needs to recover some of the loss of face that he had when he struck this deal that was so much lower than the rival code that he can't even bring himself to say the name of. He keeps calling it the FAL or whatever.
It's strange.
Yeah. So, I think this is a huge moment for him. I think he's going to be leading these negotiations, even if they continue after Abdo departs. Like, he was always in charge. Like, he didn't need to have these clubs come out and say that they wanted him to do it. He knew they would.
100%. And look, the flip side of that is he's called himself a kamikaze pilot in an interview earlier this year, and he is going to go all out to get the biggest number he can. And it may be at the risk of the product or at risk of production costs or other things. That headline number is so important. Do you think that there's a chance, though, that this could backfire on him?
It's hard to say because this is such a valuable asset to everyone who has it. The real unknowns, like, yes, Amazon is an unknown. The other one is Paramount. So Paramount owns Channel 10. They've just been acquired in the last year or two by David Ellison, who is the son of Larry Ellison, who is one of the world's richest men, founders of Oracle in the US. David Ellison founded Skydance, which, rebooted Top Gun, does a bunch of really popular movies. And Skydance Media took over Paramount. There's a lot of mergers and acquisitions in the US and in Hollywood. And Paramount Skydance, as the company is now called, has made a successful bid for Warner Brothers Discovery, which is HBO and a bunch of movies and networks. So they're in the middle of this really complicated, it's like $100 $60 billion merger in Australian dollars, something massive. And they are in the middle of this really complex merger. Do they have the headspace to fly somebody down to Australia to lay out a plan to take all of the free-to-air and streaming rights? I have no idea. I've been trying to find out. So if somebody listening to this knows this, then please let me know. But, the thing that the complexities there are the Channel 10 free-to-air signal has been gradually turning off in some regional areas because it's carried there by Win, and Win is closely aligned with Nine because its owner is a major shareholder in Nine. So 10's free-to-air footprint is a bit challenged, but it's still a major free-to-air player, and you need a major free-to-air player as well as a streaming service to make the rights work.
Well, mate, it's super interesting, the reporting that you're doing. Amazon coming into the race is a really big deal because I think I've said on this show before that Nine and Foxtel are just as reliant on these rights as what the NRL is and getting a good deal. So they all want a result, but having a third party come in could really drive some competition here and drive an interesting result over the coming weeks as Andrew Abdo leaves the NRL, Peter V'landys takes charge. Make sure you get your subscription at afr.com for the latest on these negotiations and all of the other stories that Sam is following. Sam, thanks so much for joining us here on Moneyball.
Appreciate the shout out, appreciate the plug, and appreciate you inviting me on.
Moneyball.
Well, I've got to say, this is one of the biggest commercial moments in the history of the NRL. Peter V'landys has staked his claim on a deal at $4 billion plus for the next broadcast deal, but he is negotiating in a far tougher market than when the AFL got its deal done for $4.5 billion for 7 years of broadcasting a few years back. And at the same time, as Sam says, Amazon is coming in, and that could completely reshape the equation. They decide that premium live sport is essential in Australia. The value of rugby league changes overnight. Nine and Foxtel have made their pitch, and it is time for the NRL to turn the focus on those bids as Andrew Abdo exits and Peter V'landys is essentially taking control of the process. And over the next few weeks, we're going to find out whether the NRL can actually land the biggest rights deal in Australian sporting history. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe for more breakdowns of the business of sport. You can follow the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you've got a question or you want to pitch a guest to come on the show, you can email me anytime. It's askmoneyball.show@gmail.com. Well, thanks for listening and watching. And remember, if you want to know what's really going on in sport, you've got to follow the money.